Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Week 9 edition of the Football Diehards DFS show. I am your host, Jamie Calandro, joined as always by my excellent co-host, Eric Romoff. We're going to be breaking down the entire Week 9 DFS slate. Eric, we're officially in the second half of the NFL season now. We can say, no, Week 18. I keep saying this every week. This is the last week of the first half. Next week will be Week 10, and we start the second half. But we've got several buys to tackle this week and some injuries, but let's take care of some housekeeping. First of all, how you doing, and how was your Week 8 for DFS?
I'm doing well. Week 8 was it was fun. It was a profitable week, which I think is the important context to keep in mind always. But it was a bit of a missed opportunity, right? I had a lot of my double stacks and my run backs do very well, but I just had a little too much Raheem Mostert, a little too much Wan'Dale Robinson to really get into that kind of top tier of the payout. So, like I said, I will never complain about a profitable week, but when you do the hard thing and the easy part is the one that comes up short, it always leaves a little bit of a bitter taste.
That's true. It definitely does. And it's hard to complain because you're right. Wins are wins. Same as when you go to the casino. If you walk out of there with some of their money, even if you gave some of it back, you can count it a win. This was the second. This is two straight very strong weeks for me. So I'm kind of flying high right now. I'm hoping it continues. The chalk is pretty much all hitting that I was, have been on the last week. And we've got some plays like that this week that I think we're going to build around too. As always, we are live on YouTube right now. So if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We're going to try and do kind of a core thing as we go along. We're going to break down every game one by one as we usually do, but we're also going to kind of from a cash perspective, put in some that we consider to be like our cash cores. That could be 3 or 4 players that we're building these lineups around. So when we kind of get on that game, we'll highlight them and we'll wrap up our cores at the end. And even with GPPs, Eric, if there's a GPP player or a stack that you're, or one of us is super heavy on, we can be throwing that in as well to see, where we're above or overweight or underweight on in some of these tournaments, because we are here to suit all DFS players' needs. Before we begin, though, I've been meaning to let you do this for this week, but I get so wrapped up in the thing. So Eric, for those of you that don't know, is the man behind one of the better charities in fantasy football, the Pros with Joes, which is in full swing right now. I'm involved in one of the leagues. My co-manager and I, Jack, have been running into some serious bad luck all season long. Hopefully it's turning around right now as we've unlocked Travis Etienne, who we'll talk about on this show. But Eric, do you want to say a couple of things about Pros with Joes and the origin or anything like that, and what you're looking forward to with that league?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, which is not in my nature. I'm actually wearing a Pros with Joes shirt today. Pros with Joes is a charity fantasy football league. What's different about our find is that every one of our 56 teams that's participating is a pair of co-managers, a fantasy pro, and a quote-unquote Joe who donated to that pro's charity of choice to win their way into the league. So 112 people. It ends up being a lot of fun. We are still raising money that will go to our winning pros charity of choice. So all of the words that I'll guys from hearing right now and try to get back to the DFS slate can be found at our website, proswithjoes.com. You can still donate there. You can buy some of these cool T-shirts. That money all goes to Fantasy Cares as well. Just a ton of great causes that we're working in support of, and it always ends up being a fun time. And definitely appreciate you participating, Jamie.
Oh, I love doing that every year. I love meeting people and hooking up with some of these managers that I've never met, and we text each other now, and we're both Giant fans, as it just kind of turned out this week. So we kind of just text each other on the fly about stuff like that, not even fantasy related. So it's been a great time and definitely for a great cause. So thank you for that. We are going to get started with our DFS breakdown right now. Before we do that, we have a question in the chat from Cardiac Kid on Season Long and a DFS question from him, which we'll get to when we get to that game. But, real quick, Eric, full point PPR. You need to start two of the following three: ETN, Walker, or Josh Palmer. So for me, I get the Josh Palmer appeal as the kind of de facto wide receiver one there, but it's the running backs for me. What about you?
Yeah, that is absolutely the correct choice. It's ETN and Walker. While it's nice to take advantage, or you want to take advantage of a player that has this kind of narrow window of opportunity, you can't go off and bench your studs just to take advantage of Palmer's 1 week to be the lead receiver there. So, got to be the two RBs for me as well.
Yeah, so we're in agreement on that with the two running backs. All right, so we're going to get into the DFS now. Again, like I said, a 10-game slate we're working with right now. A little lesser than normal because of some buys, which is going to condense ownership a lot more at some of these players, which you'll see in DFS games. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Seattle Seahawks at the Arizona Cardinals, which is pretty popular on this slate. It's looking like right now. From a stack perspective, some of the players in this game more so than others. And it's got the most track meet potential, I think, right now on paper of any of these games. It's the highest total game on the slate at 50. It's just a 2-point spread with the Cardinals being 2-point home favorites. So let's kind of start with the Seahawks, who are one of the more surprising teams in the NFL. That Geno Smith is the overall QB7 for this year, and he's got the third highest passer rating. I don't think any of us saw that happening. But from a DFS perspective, DraftKings simply refuses to price him up. He's still under 6,000. He's 5,800, so he's carrying some rostership at that price. I think he's perfectly fine in as a cash play to use because there are some similar ones that we'll get to at that price tag if you want to be in that range. And he is currently looking like he's the second highest rostered quarterback on the slate behind Josh Allen. So I think he's fine to do from a cash perspective. From a GPP angle, Eric, what would you be doing if you were stacking Seahawks? Are you stacking Seahawks, and how are you going about it exactly?
Yeah, I think a Seahawks stack is in play, right? For me, the way that I'm going to devise my quarterback strategy for this game is really just keeping a close eye on ownership into the wee hours of tomorrow morning, right? Whichever of these two quarterbacks is going to be less rostered is probably the one that I want to go after. In a vacuum, I would prefer Kyler just a bit. Geno's doing fine, but it's really more consistency that has him, at QB7 on the year, and he doesn't quite have the upside that I would look for to really be excited about rostering him in a GPP. So, unless he's going to be, considerably lower owned, I'd probably err on the Kyler side, kind of deciding between the two. But I mean, he has plenty of merit to be there. I'll probably find myself going a different direction.
Yeah, you make a good point about Geno. I mean, he kind of screams more of a cash play, right, than GPP. I mean, he had that colossal ceiling game against the Lions in Week 4 that most quarterbacks have had against
As they
Detroit.
all do, yeah.
Yeah, I think his biggest surprise was the one later on against New Orleans in Week 5, the next week, where he put up 24 DraftKings points. But in that one, he only threw the ball 25 times. He hasn't had a game. Where he's only had 2 games where he's thrown over 33 passes. He threw 34 last week against the Giants, and then he threw 44 in a game against Atlanta. So he's not a volume quarterback, despite the 2 wide receivers that he has there. So I'm kind of in agreement with you that if I was stacking this game, I'd lean the Cardinals side and Kyler for his upside. But which of the 2 wide receivers of Lockett and DK, if you're picking one, are you using in this one? Because the Cardinals can be a little bit of a confusing defense against wide receiver ones. And a team like the Seahawks that kind of have 1 and 1As, it might be a little bit tough for owners to pick. So where would you go here?
Yeah, I would lean towards the DK side. Generally, I like him to have more upside consistently, which is kind of a oxymoronic concept, but his upside is always going to be higher, whereas I think Lockett's is a little bit more game script or matchup dependent. 2, he's a little bit more expensive, so I expect he would be on less rosters. Right now, I'm seeing them with Lockett at about 11%, and with Metcalf pushing 7.5 or 8%. And specifically looking at Metcalf's matchup, we've been abusing these Cardinals secondary pretty much all season, but over the last couple of weeks, Byron Murphy has kind of come on for them, and DK Metcalf is going to see less of him than Lockett will, given how frequently Lockett lines up in the slot. So there are enough things that are kind of stacking up in the pros side of the column for Metcalf that would have me leaning that way.
Yeah, and again, just to bring that up, Lockett's worst game of this year by far was against Byron Murphy back in week 6. So I'm with you on that. He caught 2 passes for 17 yards on 5 targets. Again, game script could have played a little bit of a part in there. They kind of did running and defense to win that. Walker was the star there. But, you make a valid point that if you look at a sea of consistent games of Lockett and that dud thrown right in, Murphy had a big part of that one. So I'm with you that I like DK here. Let's talk about the aforementioned Walker. He is averaging almost 22 touches per game for his 4 starts, 110 yards per game. Travis Homer came back from IR last week, but Walker still played 77% of snaps, and the Cardinals are giving up 4.6 yards per carry, and they've given up 8 rushing touchdowns. So Walker, as I'm looking here right now, as far as rostership goes, is looking like he is just outside the top 5. So he's not a chalk running back for once this week, despite the fact that he's still only 6,200, below Travis Etienne, below Joe Mixon, the same price as Ramondre Stevenson, who are all projecting much, much higher owned. So how are you treating that?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. I mean, outside of the top 5 is certainly not what we would consider to be highly rostered, right? But I think his projected rostership is higher than what I was expecting, right? He was mega chalk last week, and he did fine. He didn't explode, right? So usually whenever that happens, there's a whiplash effect, and that player's rostership just plummets the next week. So to see him around that kind of 13, 15% was a little bit surprising for me. But on a 10-game slate, I think it's perfectly fine, right? Generally speaking, when we talk about the highest point total game on the slate, usually people tend to err towards the passing game as where they're going to get their exposure to that game in particular. So like Walker as a way to get a little bit different. The matchup is somewhat neutral. It's really the volume, right? If he's going to be touching the ball 20 to 25 times in tomorrow's game, he has a really good chance to score multiple touchdowns. And 6.2K, I mean, we talk about guys to consider as potential core players in a cash game. He is just flatly too cheap, right? Like, he's got such good points per dollar value out there that I love building around Walker in a cash context.
You can't not at this point. And we're gonna kind of segue a little bit. Cardiac Kid in our chat has asked a very good DFS question. So as we move to the Arizona side here, his question is, would you recommend an Arizona QB wide receiver stack with a Seattle running back or wide receiver stack, or is that too much on one game? So that's a good question. So first of all, that's not too much on one game. That's pretty much how you stack. People will kind of get married to those single stacks. The double stacks will gain you leverage. In a game like this where you're projecting ceiling games, you want that bring back more often than not, most of the time. So, I mean, for me, the Arizona side, I already have one that's like this, and it's got Kyler, it's got Hopkins, and it's got Ertz as my third one, not a wide receiver one. Simply for me because Robbie Anderson and Rondale Moore cut into each other on the perimeter too much. And until Rondale Moore isn't on the perimeter, I'm not really on him because he's getting swallowed up by those bigger corners on the outside. He belongs in the slot. But Seattle's given up the most fantasy points per game to tight ends. So even with more mouths to feed, I like the Ertz side. And then, with Seattle, you can kind of bring that back with any of the player that you feel comfortable with or that fits your build there. what Seattle player would you use in a stack like that? You know,
Yeah, I mean, I would go to something pretty close to what was offered up in the question, right? Running that back with Ken Walker, we talked about how expansive his role is in the offense, but also there's a game script that fits that really well, right? One where the Seahawks are able to establish a lead early, continue to pound the rock. More time you're going to get Ken Walker, the more likely he is, and then the Cardinals are in catch-up mode. Which, if you've watched any Cardinals football this year, that's basically how all of their games have gone, right? But for maybe the New Orleans game, they're always looking like an absolute mess out there for 3 or so quarters and then just absolutely catch fire to games. So I like how, that with your stack and your run back also fits a very likely game script for these two teams.
Yep, I agree, and that's also a big part of stacking that you want. You kind of want to tell a story with the game. If you're stacking these wide receivers, it's for a reason that you're stacking that they're going to be playing from behind, and then the other team is going to be, using Walker to grind out that fourth quarter. Or if you think it's going to be close, then you play for a passing stack. You kind of want to tell the story of the game as you build in those stacks. As we're talking about the Cardinals, it's almost impossible to not love DeAndre Hopkins here, right? I mean, he's since he's come back, he's got 22 catches, 9.7 yards per target, and a touchdown. He and Murray are just kind of like they fell right into lockstep with each other the minute he came back, and Seattle's got nobody to stop them on the perimeter. So, are you okay with his price tag of $7,900 in cash, or is that something you would leave to GPP with stacks with Murray?
No, I think it's in play for cash. For what he has been, it's probably a little bit too cheap, right? If you want to make an argument against him, he should see a fair amount of Tariq Woolen, who has been absolutely coming on over these last couple of weeks, right? I think he actually won the defensive player in the league for the NFC last month, defensive player of the month in the NFC last month. It's a tough out, but the reality is the Seahawks play a lot of zone, and DeAndre Hopkins is very good at getting open in those soft spots in the zone and catching the ball, right? So even with a tough matchup, maybe it limits his yard after catch ability, but he should still be in line to catch, upwards of 9-10 passes tomorrow. That type of volume is critical in cash.
And he's not really priced like it too. I mean, it would seem like 7,900 is a full-ish price for a receiver, but he's the sixth highest priced wide receiver on the slate right now. And there's nothing wrong with paying the little extra to get the guys above him too, if you look at who they are. But with Cooper Kupp kind of banged up and facing Tampa Bay, who is not the defense that it was, but stronger than Seattle overall. I kind of like the $1,000 savings to go to Hopkins on that too. And I actually have Hopkins outscoring Kupp from a raw total perspective this week in my Fantasy Pros rankings. So I'm not opposed to him in any format at all here. So so that's about. Anything else that we missed on this game that you want to cover before we move on?
So we'll want to watch the news on James Conner, right? He's very much so legitimately questionable, pain tolerance with his rib issue. It's a 4:05 game, so the reason why I think that's notable is really whichever of these running backs for Arizona ends up getting the start, I think should be in play, right? Seattle is the second most favorable in terms of fantasy points allowed matchup to opposing running backs. Also, with it being a later game and there being injury question marks, that's going to drive both of these players' rosterships just way down, right? So if you're looking for a way to get into this game in the kind of low single-digit territories, love either Connor or Eno Benjamin, whichever way the start ends up falling. The other guy I want to mention is one that you mentioned in your stack, Zach Ertz. I have no idea why. Maybe it's because he's the most expensive tight end on the board this week, but he's projected to be on 3% of rosters. That is criminally low for what his production has been, what his role in this offense is, how favorable matchup it is against Seattle. So if he's going to stay anywhere below 10%, he might be pretty close to a lock button for me.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, that's the kind of upside that you look for at almost no rostership in a GPP
Yeah.
with Ertz. And I think you're probably right. It's the fact that you don't need to pay for tight end at all this week, and most people won't be because there's so many in that 3,000 something range that you could play in cash and in GPP that nobody's just
Noah
getting
Fant,
there.
right?
But
2.9K.
yeah, oh God, yep. No, you're right. You're right, and that's kind of we'll tell that story too. But I love it. I'm going to be doing that a ton in GPPs, even in a cash play. I mean, if you have the money, I don't think you need to get there in cash. But I mean, if you want to ignore ownership, I do think he has the highest floor. Hence the price tag. But we're going to move on right now and go to the next game. And I see the questions in the chat. We will get to them shortly, but I want to get a couple of these games out of the way first before we start tackling those season-long questions in there. And the next game is Green Bay Detroit. And so we're going to kind of go back to this. We had another question from Cardiac Kid in the chat, a DFS question about Rodgers. So his question is, for DFS, do you expect Rodgers to have a high ownership because of his low salary and high upside? So yeah, so let's start this game. Rodgers, as far as ownership goes right now, I'm just kind of checking. He is looking like he's kind of right there with Geno Smith. They're the same ish price tag. He's $100 more. And they're kind of projecting at about the same ownership right now. So if you're looking at one of a quarterback like that, you're really kind of playing consistency of Geno in a potential high scoring game versus the pedigree of Rodgers in what should be a get right game against Detroit, who has been the team that's been allowing ceiling games to the quarterback with Rodgers. So I'll start this one, and I'll kind of give you my hesitancy on this game from a GPP perspective. First of all, for cash, right now in my placeholder, Rodgers is the quarterback that I have. I think he is fairly safe for that. I don't think he's going to kill me at 5,900. I'm hoping that he has that ceiling game if I do stick with him against Detroit, who's given up over 32 points per game and the highest yards per attempt to quarterbacks. So that's kind of where Rodgers sits. He's only had one top 12 finish this year, and that was against the Giants, and he finished 12th. So, there's definite concern for him. My biggest thing in GPP is with Alan Lazard looking like he's likely to return. I have really no idea who to stack him with in GPP. I do have one thing I'm doing where I'm stacking just Rodgers with Aaron Jones, who we can talk about too. But as far as all those receivers, plus the tight end Robert Tonyan, I just don't really know where the bankable production is. So maybe that's better for GPP. Eric, maybe you could shed some light on where you would attack Rodgers with.
Yeah, so I think the correct answer is the one that you offered up. I love firing him up with Aaron Jones, even just the two of them, right? There aren't going to be a whole lot of stacks with just those two pieces, right? Usually the players that are going to be in this Green Bay game are going to be trying to overload either side, right? So a little bit of a different texture to your roster overall. But to your point, navigating these pass catchers, if this game really shoots out to the point that Vegas is projecting it to, which I have some doubt around, but if it gets up to that total, figuring out the pass catchers for Green Bay is going to be one of those kind of upside generating propositions, right? So for me, I think it's really about looking at the matchups, right? Lazard and Dobbs should have the most clear path to volume, which is a very good thing. Among them, I mean, I guess Dobbs will see a little bit more of Owarie, which is the most favorable of the matchups, but they're all very, very good against this Detroit secondary, right? So, whenever I'm in this situation, specifically in GPPs, this is where I really just look at it as managing and balancing exposures, right? I want to lock in Rodgers and Jones as kind of the core to this stack, and then just rotate around the other pass catchers. I mean, if we want to attack Awarie, Sammy Watkins should see more of him than anybody else, right? And is probably going to be in like that 2% rostership range. So, that sounds like an appealing play on its face because Sammy Watkins will have his 1 week of glory, whichever week it might be. But ultimately, in these situations, you gotta put the guys in the pool and try to touch them all with variations in your build.
Yeah, I think that's the way. And again, Cardiac Kid has another one in here. Would a Rogers Jones Tunyon stack be viable? Isn't Detroit pretty bad against tight ends also? Yeah, they're bad. They're bad against everybody.
Full stop.
And yeah, that's perfectly fine. I do think that Tunyon is losing enough playing time to Josiah DeGuara right now to lower his floor. But I mean, to your point that Detroit's being bad against all facets of the offense. I mean, they've given up the fifth most fantasy points per game to tight end. I think it's fine. He's just, I wouldn't say he's any better or worse than any of the other guys that we mentioned here. But I mean, I think you can do any other piece with that. But I do agree with Eric, and I said it too, that Rogers Jones, I think, is the safest. The safest pairing on this slate if you want to kind of bank on a floor here. So Green Bay is tricky. How about the Detroit side? I love Amon-Ra St. Brown, especially at 6,600. Devondre Campbell is out for Green Bay, which really helps the middle of the field where St. Brown will be all over the place. The fact that they traded TJ Hawkinson just raises his target share even more. So, I mean, he's borderline cash lock for me at 6,600. I think he's far too cheap for that. I know Green Bay on paper is not a good matchup for wide receivers, but kind of things are setting up to circumvent that. Where are you on St. Brown and any other Lions you're interested in?
Yeah, so I couldn't be more in agreement with your St. Brown take. The only
I
thing
thought
that
you were going to say
I'll kind
disagreement
of
there.
no, not at all. The only thing I'll kind of double click on, you're right that on paper this looks like a tough matchup for opposing wide receivers. I think Green Bay is allowed like the fifth fewest fantasy points to the position. But on the other side of that coin, a slightly closer look will show that they're tied for fourth in terms of the highest catch rate on targets to the wide receiver. So you talk about a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown, if he's going to catch what Green Bay is currently allowing 60% of his targets, and he now has more volume headed his way because Hawkinson's gone, because Josh Reynolds looks like he's going to be unavailable. All of a sudden he is exactly what you're looking for in a cash game scenario. They wrap and tackle really well. Whether he can get many yards after the catch is in question. So it's a little bit harder for me to get to him at 6.6K in GPPs. Where I'm stacking the Green Bay side heavily, he's a fine run back overall. But, really the thing to underscore here is that he is a phenomenal cash play in week 9.
Yeah, that's one of the easier calls for me as well. Any other Lions that you're looking at in this game?
Yeah, I mean, I just can't quit DeAndre Swift, right? So if he's out there, I'll have some interest. Green Bay is a very favorable matchup to opposing running backs, specifically when it comes to receiving yards and yards per reception to running backs out of the backfield. So those are things that obviously Swift does very well. The fact that Jamal Williams is there always drives his rostership down, so I like that. The other note that I'll float out there, if you want to go mega punty at tight end, James Mitchell is probably worth a dart throw or two, right? Like the reporting out of Detroit is that a lot of the reasons why they were willing to part with Hawkinson is that they felt confident in the development of James Mitchell. So, he's sitting there basically for free, right? He's not only min price, he's min price for a tight end, which is less than what you'll spend on many of your defenses this week. So if you are going to have this large pool of different variations of Green Bay and Detroit stacks, I think James Mitchell needs to be in that pool.
And right on cue, right before you started talking about that, we had a question on Mitchell in the chat from Julius Hound. So thank you for that. And I'll just throw in there as well that Mitchell averaged 16.2 yards per catch in college. So I think that you're right. I mean, technically, Brock Wright is listed as the starter. I do think that you're right that the reason they traded Hawkinson is because he is the future there. I don't know if it'll happen this week. I do know if I'm picking one of the two of those guys in GPPs, I'd go for his upside over Brock Wright because we've seen the Brock Wright story before when Hawkinson was injured in past years. He's just not it. But he is also 2,500. So if you think it's him this week, that's not a bad play either, I guess. All right. James Mitchell, one of my friends from college in the chat from Blurpy. So that's pretty cool. Thank you for that.
Tell him I said hi.
So yeah. Tell him we're playing him at 2,500. All right. So before we move on to the rest of our games, we're just going to kind of rapid fire get to some of these questions in the chat because there are a lot. And we want to make sure we at least give our takes on them here. So first one, I'm scrolling back up here. We start with Blurpy there. Should I start Waller, Engram, or Likely? Where are you on that one, Eric?
I haven't seen super clear reporting that Waller is playing. If he is, in fact, if it's been announced that he'll be out there, I'd probably go on the Waller side. If not, I like Evan Engram a lot this week. Really solid matchup, pretty well established role in this offense. So, like him in the DFS context, I'm not sure if this is season long or not, but Waller if he's playing, like Engram if not.
This would be a season-long question.
Yeah.
Same answer?
Yep.
I'm going Engram too. I know Likely will probably be the consensus pick there, but he's got a much better matchup and a longer season of bankable volume there. So I'm on Engram of those three as well. Steven Crowder, one of our regulars, Benjamin or Mostert for GPP flex. Oh, I missed a DFS question here. What do you think on that one, Eric? Eno or Mostert for GPP? I think it depends on Connor there, right? Like if Connor's in, it's not Benjamin.
Yeah, I mean that one's pretty clear, right? Assuming that Connor is out, I'm still going Benjamin there. Arizona has absolutely given the keys to Benjamin in Connor's absence. Mostert should still have the majority of the touches and the carries out of this Dolphins backfield, but it is a legitimate question mark how they're going to use Jeff Wilson, right? So I'll go on the side of the sure thing.
Yep, same with me. We have Herbert or Cousins. I'm going Herbert here, despite him missing his two wide receivers. I think that offense is due for a breakout, even shorthanded against this Atlanta defense. So I'm taking Herbert over Cousins. What about you?
I'm also taking Herbert over Cousins, but they are 7 and 8 in my rankings. So kind of a toss-up. I mean, both are in great spots. I mean, Herbert is just so much more talented than Cousins is that I'll use that as the tiebreaker.
I'm pulling up my own rankings here as we speak. I'm 6 and 8. So there's that. So it's close, but we're both leaning Herbert there. All right. Would you trade Diggs for Cook? I'm hoping that's Dalvin and Pollard. What do you think on that one?
Probably. I'm assuming you're entertaining this because you need help at the running back position and you are immensely deep at the wide receiver position. Those would be the two circumstances by which I would take this trade. And if those are both yeses for you, then yes, I'd be fine with this trade.
I agree. Trey S, full PPR, sit one, Juju, Boyd, or Josh Palmer. Well, that's a tougher one. I'm starting Boyd here. I'm looking at my own rankings right now. Juju, Boyd, or Josh Palmer. I have Boyd in of this group for sure, and I actually do have Palmer ahead of Juju for PPR. What about you?
Sweep it. That is exactly how I have it as well.
All right, beautiful. Need two in PPR: Swift, Cordarrelle Patterson, Khalil Herbert, and Deion Jackson. Where are you on that one?
I'll go with Swift and I'll go with Deion Jackson. Happy to see Cordarrelle Patterson back. We'll talk about him here in a minute. But it is his first game back, so it's not super clear how he'll be utilized.
Swift
And
and
Herbert's clearly
Jackson
in
for
this.
me too. Yeah. Swift and Jackson for me too in PPR. And finally, from Wendy Early, Drake or Singletary season long. I get the Drake love there. I'm still going Singletary here.
I'm going Singletary as well. Another incredibly close one. Singletary is 52 and Drake is 56 for me.
All right, so there we
Unless
go.
I'm
So thank you for those. Yeah, so thank you for those. We're going to move on. I'm going to harken back to that Herbert question and transition into our next game, which is the Chargers against the Falcons. And I'm going to start this game with Eckler, who is not only my RB1 overall this week, but also my skill player overall in flex. I have him as the top overall player this week. He's 8,800, which is getting near to that kind of full price tag for him. But I mean, I can't imagine not playing him in this one. This is a Falcons team that has hemorrhaged points to pass catching running backs, not just this year, but just over a 4-year period. They just always give it up out of the backfield. Eckler has played 77% of snaps before the Chargers went on a bye. They're missing Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. He is once again leading running backs in catches and targets, and I just think his floor and ceiling is unmatched on this thing. So Eckler is the guy that I'm paying for in cash this week. How about you? Is Eckler in your cash if you've built your placeholders?
Yeah, I really like Eckler in cash this week. I mean, the thing for me, right? Like we know how well established he is as a pass catcher in this offense, and I think we'll see that very much so. Sustain, if not potentially ratchet up a little bit with so many guys out. But secondarily, with so many guys out, I think we start to see him get more and more carries as well, right? I think they kind of shift to more of a run game type of offense because usually he's in kind of the low teens, right? So with so many guys down as in the receiving core, if we can get him into that kind of 15, 17 range plus his normal share of receptions, I mean that's when he's got number one overall skill player upside well represented on his range of outcomes.
Yeah, for sure. How about the wide receiver crew? We've gone from Mike Williams and Keenan Allen to Josh Palmer, DeAndre Carter, and Michael Bandy. And then, of course, with Donald Parham being put on IR, we have Gerald Everett as the second highest priced tight end behind the aforementioned Zach Ertz. Josh Palmer, I think, is someone that I'm not avoiding in cash, despite the fact that there's some things that just say he's maybe simply just not good. I do think a 5,100 wide receiver one on this team in this matchup is too tough to ignore in cash. But I'm curious as to where you're going with the Chargers and GPP here.
Yeah, it's really tough, honestly. The path will be determined by DeAndre Carter news, which is probably a statement that I never thought I would say out loud, that we're waiting for DeAndre Carter news to determine my DFS strategy. He's got this mystery illness that seemingly everyone in the league has right now, so we're not entirely sure if he's going to play. Fortunately, this is a 1:00 game, so we should have news leading up to lineup lock. If Carter's in there, I like firing up Carter, right? Your point about Palmer is spot on. 5K for a guy that should see, the majority, if not the vast majority of the targets in this offense is very much so in the cash game realm. But Carter with that questionable tag next to him, I mean, he could come in, sub 5% and still see, maybe just a few targets less than that of Josh Palmer. So like the Carter side, and I kind of like building Herbert stacks here. Like this is probably going to be one of those weeks where we're getting Herbert at one of his season low prices, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see him come in under 5% himself, right? And this is a game that I want to get into. It is a very high point total. It's pushing 49.5 is what I'm seeing live right now. So if I'm going to get, the more capable offensive side of this game for, sub 5% rostership on each leg of the stack, I absolutely love that.
I'm with you, and I'm looking down here. It looks like we've got Herbert well into that single digit rostership percentage, just below 5%. So I'm with you on that one for sure. How about the Atlanta side? We've got Cordarrelle Patterson is returning. So if you were doing a Chargers stack, who would you bring it back with? We saw Pitts kind of do what people were hoping he was going to do last week, but Chargers run defense is terrible. So, and Atlanta likes to run the ball. So is this another one where it's all the Atlanta running game and there's just not enough for Pitts and Drake London? Who would you bring a Chargers stack back with?
Probably all of them. I would hope for better line of sight as to Cordarrelle Patterson's usage in his first game. I can recklessly speculate and say that he's coming back essentially immediately as soon as he was available and is being plopped into game action as soon as he comes off IR. So that would lead me to believe that there's not concern about his health or how fully recovered he is. So if he's full go, I mean, the first 4 games of the season, he was absolutely setting the league on fire, right? He looked like the 2021 version of himself. And because it's his first game back, again, another piece that's going to be 3-4% rostered because people are going to feel unsure about it. I feel unsure about it, right? But the upside's there to where if I can get into the highest point total game and all of these pieces are 3-4-5% rostered, I can just go eat all of the good chalk everywhere else and have a significant edge on the field.
All right, yeah. So there is Chargers Falcons, and as we talk about it, I mean it's it gets more and more appealing to me as we go. So I'm going to kind of tinker with that as we go as well, especially with that Chargers sporting what looks like a 27 point team total right now. Okay, so Raiders Jacksonville is our next one we're talking about here, and I'm going to start on the Jacksonville side because the first player that kind of comes up here is one that is one of my core plays in cash for this week, and that's Travis Etienne. He has been unlocked to a full workload with the trade of James Robinson. Past 2 weeks, he's played 80% of Jacksonville's snaps. He's had 42 touches and just over 290 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Giants and the Broncos, who are both better run defenses than the Raiders, who have given up the 8th most fantasy points per game to running backs. 6,300 is just simply too cheap for that. So this is not one that I'm messing around with. He's a core play in cash. I do think that there are so many running backs in that low 3K or 6K range that I'm okay not being overweight on the field in GPP, but I'm curious your thought there.
Yeah, I've got a similar sentiment, right? One thing we should note as we talk about bye weeks, sort of compressing the slate. He's pushing 28% or so ownership. Usually that's getting into insta fade territory for me, but with just 10 games, that rostership condenses. So not afraid of that. I would probably want to be at or kind of slightly below that number. Just given that there are so many options around him, going to be in the kind of low to mid single digits. But everything from an analytics standpoint, everything from a workload and an opportunity standpoint says that this should be another fantastic week for ETN. And 6.3K, I mean, we could see a world where he goes up $2,500 by the time the season's over, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, why not? With his yards per carry and the workload, that's wide receiver 1 potential. Anyone else? What about the Jacksonville side? We've kind of both talked about Engram as, with the season long question, we leaned him over some of those more popular guys. You want to say anything about Engram for DFS? He's 3,300. He's fits that tight end punt beautifully in cash. Anything else you want to say on Engram here?
Just to sing his praises again. He's one of
Great.
my kind of anchor tight ends that I'll be rotating around. There are so many guys 3K and below that are drawing a ton of rostership to get him at 3.3K in a great matchup around 5%. I'll be well overweight to that relative to the field.
Yeah, I would tend to agree there too. And a question I've also gotten this week that I kind of want to reiterate with this is because I've been talking about the two of them a lot on Twitter and in articles. Is would you play both in cash, or in the same lineup even? Um, and I do think that in a cash lineup, it's fine. You don't need to. You're looking for floor, so it doesn't really matter if they cut into each other's ceilings. There, they just got to pay off their price tag, so you get into the top 50 of those double ups, or the top 50% of those double ups, or beat your opponent head to head. In GPP, would you play those together, or would you take a different approach?
I think you can, as long as you're stacking this game right. I'm probably looking at this Jacksonville Las Vegas game more as kind of an ancillary piece, right? I'll have a core stack on a couple of the games we talked about already, and then sort of a one by one, an ETN and an Adams, uh, ETN and a Waller, for example. So I won't have a whole lot of opportunity to play these two together, but I mean, 47.5 points is not nothing, right? So if you want to get different from the field, you can build some heavy stacks on this game, and if you do that, perfectly fine to fire up Ingram and ETN together.
And a question in the chat: what about the Jacksonville defense? 3,100 here. What do you think of them?
They're fine. There are a couple of other defenses a little bit further down the board that I like more that I would probably go to before them. But overall, I think they've got a decent shot to pay off value. We saw with Carr last week; they certainly have a decent shot to turn the ball over, which is what you're looking for. So 3.1K is fine for them.
Yeah, I agree. Um, the Raiders side, Josh Jacobs had a down game, but this looks like it's a potential rebound spot. Vegas is favored on the road against Jacksonville. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's how it is. But Jacksonville has given up the 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs. Jacobs was an elite RB1 coming into that game. The script against New Orleans, where they were shut out pretty much from day one or minute one, kind of rendered Jacobs ineffective there. But are you going back to him? His price didn't move. He's still 7,300, which is really too cheap. What do you think?
I want to go to Josh Jacobs. I talked about it a little bit with Ken Walker earlier in the show. Usually, when someone is so popular and falls so tremendously flat, we see their rostership just plummet. I'm seeing him like in the mid-teens. That's probably a little bit too high for my likings, right? I would be excited about
People
it.
aren't buying the dip.
Yeah, I mean, he's in a fine spot. Everything that you laid out from an analytical standpoint, adds up, right? Like that game was just in a one percentile outcome that absolutely threw them out of their normal offense. It will be the exception as opposed to the rule. So, very safe roll, good path to value. Just a little bit too popular for me to get on board with in a tournament context.
Yeah, I gotcha. That was kind of surprising to me too. As I was, especially with like Aaron Jones, who is, surely going to be popular at $100 more than him, and then all these 6,000 guys that we've talked about. I was kind of thinking we were going to see a bit of a dip on here, but you're right, it's not so. I mean, he's still kind of right on the cusp of that top 5 rostership projection. Anyone else on the Raiders you're looking at here?
Yeah, I wouldn't be afraid to go back to the Devontae Adams following the same thesis that I've laid out a couple times here, right? It looks like he is getting a bit more of that dip. He's kind of pushing that 10-11% range and is in a pretty solid spot overall, right? Not exactly the softest secondary out there. But Devontae Adams has made a career out of taking advantage of kind of above average corners throughout his career. So like him to do it again, especially at low rostership.
Yep, and surrounded by Diggs, Jefferson, and Tyreek Hill, there's almost none on him there for his talent level. So I like that call as well. All right, so that is Vegas, Jacksonville. We're going to move right along so we can try and get all these games in. We probably got about 20 minutes left or so. Let me just check the chat here. All right, real quick. Rapid fire. Looking for a DST from Tim Matthews. Chiefs, Seahawks, Packers, or Jaguars? What do you think there?
Chiefs, Seahawks, Packers, or Jaguars? I would probably go with the Jaguars here, unless we think that Malik Willis is starting again. Then I would go with the Chiefs.
I would tend to agree with that too. If it's Malik Willis, it's the Chiefs for sure, but I'm with you on the Jaguars as well. All right. So moving along again, we have Miami and Chicago, and we have Tyreek Hill, who is, I shouldn't just say Tyreek Hill because we've got 2 top 5 wide receivers so far in PPR for the Dolphins facing off against the Bears this week. Tyreek is at 8,500. Jalen Waddle is at 7,400. And with Tua at the helm, Tyreek, again, I've said this a few times on our show and on the show on the Football Diehards on Sirius XM NFL, which I'll be on again right after this. Tyreek Hill is on pace right now for the first ever 2,000-yard receiving season. So it's kind of weird that he's not the highest priced wide receiver. I get Cooper Kupp and Jefferson being there. If you said that they're better plays than Tyreek Hill, I wouldn't argue with you, but I like the savings if I can get it there. The Bears are a soft matchup. How are you treating Tyreek Hill this week? Are you going to play him in cash? I've dabbled around, and it's almost impossible to get him and Eckler together with some of these running back plays that we need in there in cash. So, if you're picking one of the two, who are you picking?
I guess put in that context, I would lean on the Hill side. Are you asking me if I would pick Eckler or Hill in cash? Or are you asking me
if you're forced to pick? Eckler versus Hill in cash if you're forced to pick one, because it's really kind of impossible to get to.
Yeah, I would probably go towards the Hill side, just because there are so many running backs that have really value at a considerably lower price than Eckler. Whereas, you take a similar price decrease on the wide receiver market and you get into some pretty dicey situations, right?
I'm struggling with this one big time because, I've put my stamp on Eckler as the top the top running back play, but that might be an issue or the top overall play. But this might be an issue where you might have to make a sacrifice because you're right. You can play ETN and Ramondre Stevenson and Dante Foreman or something like that, all in the low 6K range, and fit Tyreek Hill in with another receiver and be perfectly fine with it. You just got to be okay not having Eckler in there, which is something that I'll probably decide at 12:59 tomorrow. But that's kind of where we are. How about the rest of the Dolphins team outside of Tyreek? Do you think Waddle's still okay at the rising price tag?
Yeah, I do. Look, the offense that Mike McDaniels has schemed up, I feel like I sing its praises week in and week out. So I'll try to be brief in this instance, but it's an absolutely dynamic offense. It's a ton of fun to watch if you're not watching a lot of Dolphins games. And with these two players in particular, he uses them in such unique ways. He schemes them open. He puts them in positions to win after the catch. Tua is obviously very, very accurate as a quarterback. So I'm not worried about the price tag. It's kind of weird. Like coming into the season, I projected these roles to be flipped a little bit more, right? I thought Waddle would be more of the high volume guy, and Tyreek would be
Mhm.
the upside touchdown scorer, and it's been the
Right.
opposite. But practically speaking, from a DFS standpoint, in tournaments, I'm just going to continue to err on the side of whichever one is drawing lower rostership, and week in and week out, that seems to be Waddle by a good measure. So I'll have a good amount of him, even at 7.4K.
Yeah. I mean, he's a wide receiver 5. The argument that he's even with a rising price tag, the argument that it's too much is not accurate. If he's going to kind of stick in that 1A role to Tyreek Hill. So the Bears side, I'm interested in your take on Justin Fields here because one of my colleagues, Mike Husson at Fantasy Team Advice, is kind of locked in on him for cash. And, I mean, if you look at the last 2 games, he's got 3 touchdown passes. They haven't let him throw anymore. His passing attempts is right in line with what it's been. But he's got 22 carries for 142 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns on the ground. I mean, if you take that rushing floor, he's got against New England, he had 24.36 DraftKings points. Against Dallas, he had 26.04. If you take that rushing floor into account, I mean, 5,300 does seem like a steal. I just can't seem to bring myself to play a cash guy that I know is not going to throw the ball 25 times. Where are you on that? Do you think he's okay in cash at 5,300? Because I'm struggling, honestly.
Yeah, okay is a good way to put it, right? Like I'm not nearly as bullish to where as your colleague, to where I'd say he's a borderline lock or anything. What I will say about Justin Fields and about this Bears offense on the whole, they've picked up the pace over the last couple of weeks here, right? Like, I ran the math on it a few days ago. Weeks 1 through 5, they were averaging about 55 offensive snaps per game. Over the last 3, they're averaging 73. So they've increased more than 30%. So if they're going to continue to increase the pace of play to this degree, we'll see incremental upticks in pass attempts, in rushing attempts. So I think the arrow is firmly pointing up for Justin Fields as long as his trend holds. But he's certainly not set and forget in a cash context.
Yeah, it's tough, and I'm going to explore it too because the savings you can get off of him at 5,300 might prove to be significant enough where I'm okay taking some of
Eckler and
that
Hill,
risk that
right?
I'm. Yeah, exactly. Right. So I mean, it's worth exploring. All right, so Miami, Chicago in the books. We got about 15 minutes left. I kind of want to get to all these things. We got the Rams and the Bucks, which we thought, which coming in, I mean, should have been the marquee matchup, but both teams have had their issues here, namely offensive line related on both sides, and we only have a total of 42.5 in a Brady versus Stafford game. So I'm curious as to where you're looking on both sides of this game. If you can kind of give a synopsis of any cash plays and if you were playing this game in GPP, how you would do it.
Yeah, so I'm happy to go back to the well here on Cooper Cup. He's going to push 5 to 7% rostered again, and pretty much anytime that's the case, I'm going to be interested, right? Last week I was sending you drooling emojis because I had him at 5% and CMC at 3%. Like this is my turn,
Yeah.
right? His matchup against Winfield is it's moderate, right? But I think he can find those soft spots. I think we'll see the Buccaneers play the Rams the way we've seen a lot of teams play the Rams, just give them the underneath action, and that means a lot of volume for Cooper Kupp. The Rams running back room is an absolute mess, and it needs to be avoided. On the Tampa Bay side, it's a little bit trickier. I kind of like Leonard Fournette at 6.6K. His role has been getting a little bit shaky over these last few weeks. I think that we see him really reestablish himself. The thing I like about him most is that he's probably going to be sub 5%, and so if that's the case, that's usually going to be pretty interesting to me. Higbee kind of surprised me that he's pushing 9% rostership. I thought that people were going to be off him based on him coming up flat last week. That thesis seems to be whiffing this week altogether. So like you said, this should be a marquee matchup, but there's not a whole lot to like here.
Yeah, no, me too. I agree. And I guess the one thing I'll throw in that you didn't mention is Godwin as a cash play. 6,200. His price doesn't seem to move either. He hasn't
Yeah.
scored yet, which is I guess kind of keeping him leveled out in that pass thing. But I mean, if you look at it, he's got double digit targets in 4 out of his last 5 games. So I mean, it looks like a low scoring game, which I didn't think I would say with Bucks Rams, but that's the way it looks. So I think you can play him in cash. I don't think you need to force him in cash. And I agree with you on, the kind of the GPP way of going on this. Cup at single digit is something you want exposure to at all times. All right, so moving on again, we've got Carolina at Cincinnati, and Carolina continues to puzzle me here after trading away Christian McCaffrey. That PJ Walker and his negative average depth of target 2 weeks ago is putting up 34 points, and they should have won that game. DJ Moore had that taunting penalty at the end that cost them. Yeah, I mean, you can blame the kicker, I guess, if you want, but it cost them 15 yards, and they wound up losing that game. But I mean, I don't see how PJ Walker is doing the stuff that he's doing. So let's talk about this game here. We got the Panthers do only have a team total of 17 points, which kind of jives. But the Bengals did lose their top cornerback, Woozy, for the year. So I mean, I guess I'll start with the first guy, DJ Moore. What do you think on him? He's got double the targets of the next closest Panther wide receiver, which is Terrace Marshall.
Yeah, I think the story on Moore is really the price tag, right? He continues to be in this mid 5K range, and as long as that's the case, I mean, I'm gonna feel okay having him in the player pool, right? He's not going to be a centerpiece. He'll be someone that I'll rotate around, specifically in builds where I am very chalky in the rest of my construction. I'll look to Moore as a place to get a little bit different. But I mean, look, the volume's been there all year, right? It's just now seems like it's connecting with PJ Walker throwing him the ball as opposed to some combination of Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield.
Yep, and then I guess the other Carolina player that we need to talk about is Deontay Foreman, who Chuba Hubbard is out again. Foreman crushed it last week, but this is a far more difficult matchup against Cincinnati and not a favorable game script. That one with Atlanta was a pretty even game script. We could have kind of predicted, I don't know about a shootout, but a close game. With the Panthers 8.5-point underdogs against Cincinnati here, I do have concerns about Foreman's floor. So how are you treating Foreman here?
Yeah, this is probably somebody that I want to try to fade, right? We're looking at a guy that's going to push kind of mid-teens in rostership. Even that is sort of surprising. I wouldn't be surprised to see him jump up more as we get into tomorrow morning. He's coming off of that very big game. The people that played him are feeling vindicated. The people that didn't are feeling like they've missed out, and they want to go chase last week points. So these are all things that I tell myself as to why his rostership will walk up. And this is legitimately a tough out against the Cincinnati Bengals, right? They game script consideration aside, they're in the bottom third of the league in fantasy points allowed to opposing rushers, and yes, he could potentially break one, but they've done a pretty good job of bottling up running backs this year. So the odds are not in his favor, and if he's going to be popular, that's a situation I want to avoid.
Yeah, he's kind of in my fade as well. It's mostly just to cap that off what you said. He's not involved in the passing game at all, which definitely lowers his floor for this one. Touchdown dependent is something that I don't like to go to in DFS so much. I want that floor for a running back that at least they're somewhat involved in the passing game, unless their name is Derrick Henry. But he's got 41 carries over the last 2 weeks. He's also got 3 targets. He only had one in that game against Atlanta, and that's a pristine matchup for running backs out of the backfield. So I definitely have concerns there for him. What about the Cincinnati side? How are you treating them as 8-point favorites against Carolina?
Yeah, I mean there are guys that are interesting here, right? Boyd's probably the most interesting at cost, just given that he's in the low 6Ks. Joe Mixon's kind of had a rough go over these last few weeks, so I don't really like him at the high teens rostership that I'm seeing. If I can find my way into a run back that I like, I wouldn't mind getting a little cheeky with some Joe Burrow stacks, maybe running it back with DJ Moore. Now that I say it out loud, but ultimately I don't know if this game is going to score enough for it to really be interesting for me.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I do like Mixon at cost. 6,500 Mixon is something I'm definitely interested in. But you're right. His rostership percentage is just annoying enough that you're not gaining too much leverage in a potentially low scoring game here. All right, so
Right.
moving on again, we got a little under 10 minutes left, and we got 3 more games to talk about here. So the Bills and Jets. So let's talk about Josh Allen. How are you treating Josh Allen? Right now, he's looking like the most rostered quarterback on the slate, even at 8,500. Obviously, it's fine to play him in cash if that's where you want your money to go. I don't think anyone would argue. I'm probably not doing it, but what's your take on Allen? Besides that, he's the best.
Yeah, I mean, he's just absolutely the best, right? Um, Super safe. I'm not worried about the matchup. This Jet secondary is tough, but Allen can get it done so many ways. I think the consideration is exactly what you said. Like to go up to an $8,500 quarterback on this slate where we're going to be pinching pennies is not something that I'm going to go out of my way to do. Um, so cash game, certainly in the mix, but not really going to find much Allen in my tournament builds.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And I guess just on the Bills side, again, I think we're in agreement that you can stack Bills however you really want. But I will ask you this because I've gotten this question too. Um, I think, well, I'll ask you, are you worried about Diggs at all with Sauce Gardner?
Not especially. Right, like we talk about tough matchups and doing wide receiver cornerback matchups in general, and it's a helpful tool when you're kind of determining where you want to prioritize. But at a certain point, you get to a level of receiver that can really take advantage of almost any matchup, right? And Diggs is certainly in that category, right? So his upside is probably limited a little bit, with a tough out against Sauce. But a lot of times we're talking about their ability to win 1-on-1, and I'll take Diggs over Gardner, 9 times out of 10. So, not someone that I'm going out of my way to roster, but I also think that this matchup isn't as big of a downgrade for a player of Diggs's caliber as it is for some of the kind of second and third tier wide receivers out there.
I agree. And Diggs is possibly the best route runner in the NFL. So, I mean, I'd bet on him over Sauce, but I do get the question behind that thing.
Yeah.
How about the Jets? Anybody on the Jets side that you're looking to roster against this Bills defense?
Not necessarily. I mean, I say that with Garrett Wilson being on my best roster last week, right? He was 2% as opposed to 7% this week. So, people are chasing that production from last week. There's really not anyone that I expect to, come in so low owned that they're worthy of consideration. Maybe Michael Carter at 5.5K.
Mm-hmm.
But even that, I mean, you're not going to feel good about it. This Jets team total is right around 17, so you're getting into a very low scoring situation, and that's why DFS is great, right? You can avoid these situations.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And yeah, watch James Robinson's status as well there too. I don't think it affects Carter's, upside as much as people will have you believe. But I mean, if he's not out there and Carter is the lead guy, that does say something. All right, so 2 games left. New England, Indianapolis. I think the main points here that we need to touch on is Ramondre Stevenson for New England, who is coming in as what looks to be the highest owned skill player on the slate, with the assumption that Damian Harris is out. Before we started this show, I saw this rostership percentage, and I asked you, Damian Harris must be out, right? It's not official. I think everybody's assuming that he is. I think you play him anyway. He's clearly the lead back, and if Harris does sit, he is an absolute 100% core play in cash, and I'll even go so far as to say more so than Travis Etienne. How about you on Ramondre for GPP?
Yeah, he's fine in GPP. I'm generally looking to fade whoever the most popular player is, unless it's just an absolute smash spot. Indy's run defense is somewhat of a tough out. So, if he is going to push north of 20 in a bad matchup in a game that isn't going to score a whole lot, I want to be underweight to the field. But that's these are all limiting factors to his upside. His role is also well cemented that he needs to be on the cash game radar for sure.
Yeah, and again, with the difference between cash and GPP, he doesn't need to break the slate for you in cash.
Right.
The fact that he's got 15 targets over the last 2 weeks and caught all 15 balls on top of his rushing floor is more than enough for cash. And if he's getting the full load there, that's where you want to go to. But I mean, you're absolutely right. These are not the GPP games we're talking about here to be stacking. So the other guy I'll bring up in this game is Deion Jackson on the other side, who Jonathan Taylor is out, and he's $5,200. What are your thoughts on Deion Jackson?
Deion Jackson feels like bad chalk to me. Um, you know, he played very well the last time that he got the start. Got the lion's share of the work there. But this is a very tough out against New England, and he's going to be very popular. And I don't have any faith in Sam Ehlinger's ability to move the ball. We also have to account for Sam Ehlinger taking some of this rushing workload, which was not the case the last time we saw Deion Jackson out there. So for him to be pushing 20% as well, it sends up a lot of red flags for me. His volume should be, at a point where he's got a good path to pay off 5.2K. But there are too many things stacked against him for him to be in my pool in tournaments.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to your point that it's just not the game, that you're looking for upside. All right, so one more game. We got a couple minutes left. I just want to touch on this game on a couple of points too, and that's Minnesota Washington. I will say that there's no one in this game that interests me from a cash perspective. I love Justin Jefferson in GPP against this Washington secondary. And I really like Antonio Gibson on the other side in GPPs at 5,500 with J.D. McKissick ruled out. Brian Robinson only has 2 targets in the 4 games that he's played, and Gibson was kind of once again the starter last week. So I think at 5,500, even in not the greatest matchup, he's really got some sneaky upside here. What do you think about Gibson? And just as we wrap up, anyone else in this game you're looking at?
Yeah, love that Gibson call. He's more into that kind of offensive weapon mold that he played in college, which is great to see. It fits him. It suits him very well. So, love that call, especially the context that he'll probably come in at like 5 or 6% rostered, right? So, in general, I like this game a lot more than Vegas does. I think this is a game that can push into the upper 40s or even flirt with 50, just given how these two defenses match up together. Justin Jefferson is absolutely it. Almost like Cooper Kupp, you're gonna get him at single digit rostership. He needs to be in your pool on the tournament side. Same thing goes for Terry McLaurin, right? He's he is back in the good graces of Taylor Heineke under center. So if he's going to continue to see this volume, has very favorable matchups for the majority of his snaps, should be able to avoid Patrick Peterson where he can. So don't mind that on the run back side. What I will warn is this is not the week for TJ Hawkinson. It takes a while for tight ends to integrate into an offense, and the first week is not going to be the one where Hawkinson's going to pay off a $5K price tag.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And I'm trying to think who the tight end was that I picked over him in a question earlier on Twitter today, that somebody was like, "You're crazy. Hawkinson's a top 5 tight end," and that thing. And while that may be the case, it was I can't remember who it was. Maybe I'll post it if I do remember that. But it was someone that ordinarily would not be over TJ Hawkinson. But I do agree with you there. That is going to do it for us in week 9. We got to all 10 games here. So again, make sure to check us out over at Football Diehards, all the great work that we have going on there. Eric and I are here with you Saturday nights, always from 9 Eastern till about this time, 10:15, 10:20, breaking down the slate. We'll be doing it again all season. I am bouncing right over to Sirius XM NFL radio with Bob and Mike, the Football Diehards, to talk a little more DFS. So if you want to hear some of this stuff rehash and potentially some new information, join me over there with those guys. Eric, anything you want to promote before we sign off here?
Yes. Green Screens Media on YouTube is a project of mine. We cover many sports, but our focal point is largely college basketball, which starts on Monday. So Green Screens Media on YouTube. We have a ton of research and information from the course of the offseason, and we are ramped up to be crushing some college basketball DFS slates this year.
Oh, man, I will be checking that out for sure. I can't wait for college basketball to begin. So that's a great one to think about. I'll be texting you about that. Thank you, Eric. As always, a great job. Thank you to everyone who joined us in the chat and brought your questions. I'm so glad we had a lot of DFS-related questions tonight. It really kind of sets us up for what we're talking about. And again, tweet me and Eric. I'm at JAC3600. Eric is at Fantasy Nav, Fantasy NAV. We'll answer your questions whenever you want, along with all our colleagues at Football Diehards. I can't speak at the end of the show here, apparently, but we can take it on Twitter for you. Thank you.